Hello and welcome back. I'm Mike Damasi, and I'd like to make another presentation for you today, specifically dealing with the um, Vinyasa Krama system. And I'll start with an invocation to the sage Patanjali, who authored an important text, a yoga text, by the name of the Yoga Sutra. And just going to chant. It's non-religious. It's just honoring the teacher that gave us these magnificent teachings on the subject of yoga, the classical subject of yoga. And if you're coming from Ashtanga Vinyasa, you may recognize part of the chant. If you're coming from Iyengar Yoga, you'll recognize also part of the chant. There's a way of chanting it in the Deshikachara lineage as well. I'll be chanting it in the manner that my teacher chants it, my teacher Srivatsa Ramaswamy. Om Aindu Karattane Ane Mohattane Indi Nilampere Pondre Etrane Nandi Mahandane Jnana Kurundane Pundi Vaitadi Putru Enrene Yastyaktva Rupamadhyam Prabhavad Jagato Nekadanugrahaya Prakshina Kleshara Shira Vishama Vishadaro Nekavaktra Subhogi Sarvajnana Prasutirbushaka Parikara Priteye Yasya Nityam Nevo Hisha Savo Vyacita Vimalatanur Yogado Yoga Yuktaha Yogena Chittasya Padena Vacha Malam Sharirasya Chavaidyakena Yopakarotam Pravaram Muninam Patanjalim Pranjariranatosmi Abahu Purushakaram Shankachakrasidharinam Sahasrashirasham Shvetam Pranamami Patanjalim Shrimate Anantaya Nagarajaya Namo Namaha Asmadacharye Sarvebhyo Namo Namaha Om. All right, so thanks again for joining. So again, this is covering the yoga of Sri Tirumalai Krishnamacharya in a rather brief way. I'll try to cover it as comprehensively as I can as at that. Obviously, Krishnamacharya wasn't the only authority. There's other contemporaries of his like Swami Kuvalyananda, Swami Shivananda, Sri Yogendra, and these are only the acharyas that are known internationally. Then there's a whole slew of acharyas in India that foreigners aren't aware of. But anyways, nonetheless, Sri Tirumalai Krishnamacharya has made quite a mark on yoga as it's understood internationally. Certainly in this understanding of vinyasa, if it's not altogether preserved in the current iterations among the Western vinyasa flow type classes. So what is this traditional vinyasa krama system? The traditional vinyasa krama. Well, firstly, why am I even making this presentation? There could be people like me that came from Iyengar Yoga. Maybe you're currently a very diligent practitioner of Iyengar Yoga or Ashtanga Vinyasa. These are some of the very well-known schools coming from the Yogacharya Sri Krishnamacharya. B.K.S. Iyengar, who learned from Krishnamacharya in the 1930s in Mysore, and then proceeded to relocate to Pune to take on a teaching post, and then the rest is history, of course. B.K.S. Iyengar is responsible in no small part to the international dissemination of yoga teachings. And so was his colleague also responsible for the international transmission, his colleague Pattabhi Jois, who transmitted what he referred to as Ashtanga Vinyasa. Now, note on Iyengar, of course, he admits that he was trying to evolve and develop the system. So he didn't stick strictly to what he was taught. He was trying to develop something he felt was useful to himself and to students at large. Pattabhi Jois, on the other hand, tried to teach in a way reminiscent of how he was taught as a young athletic teenager in Mysore. Very rigorous set of asanas in a sort of drill set sequence. Nevertheless, Iyengar didn't teach a set sequence, and it seems that Krishnamacharya, when he taught one-on-one, he was not teaching set sequences. Nevertheless, these set sequences is coming down from Pattabhi Jois, which seem to come from Krishnamacharya, as we can see these Yogasana lists in Krishnamacharya's book, the Yogasana Galu. So some people take to this practice, so of course. But anyways, if you're here watching, maybe you're curious, what are these traditional teachings of Vinyasa Krama of Sri Tirumalai Krishnamacharya? And namely through his pupil Srivatsa Ramaswamy, who's a very long time pupil of Krishnamacharya's. He's not the only long time pupil. He's my teacher in any case. And I'd like to point out that for those that are familiar with Iyengar Yoga and Ashtanga Vinyasa, perhaps you'll notice that there's differences in what those systems teach. And certainly you have to take into account Iyengar was trying to develop something different upon the initial system that he was taught from Sri Krishnamacharya. He owes in part to his teacher Krishnamacharya for the system that Iyengar himself teaches, in that the asanas, the system, the pranayama, it's all coming from the system that Krishnamacharya teaches. It didn't come out of nowhere, obviously, but Iyengar obviously put some other aspects in. Now, so I'd like to start. So what's lesser known, as I said, Ashtanga Vinyasa and Iyengar Yoga are more well known, and maybe you're curious to know about Srivatsa Ramaswamy's teachings, and as it relates to TKV Deshikacharya's teachings. TKV Deshikacharya, of course, is the middle son of the professor Krishnamacharya, and there's other family members that are teaching. So there's TKV Deshikacharya, of course, passed. His younger brother also passed, unfortunately, but he also made an international mark in Europe, predominantly, TK Sribashyam. And their youngest sister, Sri Shubha Mohan Kumar, who's based in Bangalore, is also teaching. And she teaches Vinyasa Krama. And then there's also A.G. Mohan that teaches also, along with his family, Indra Mohan and his two children that are his grown-up children. I'd like to point out that while also there are distinctions of emphasis between the later teachers coming from Krishnamacharya's Madras Chennai period, from 1950s on to his death in 1989. I'd like to point out, though there are these distinctions, there's tremendous confluence between these teachings from these various teachers, pupils of Krishnamacharya's from his latter Chennai period. So you'll notice, if you do delve into TKV Deshikacharya's teachings, yes, there are distinctions, but it's very much the same system. They have a lot of the same tools it's the same system. The same thing if you take classes with Sri Shubha. So she's the youngest daughter of Krishnamacharyas. She's teaching Vinyasa Krama. There's some little differences in how she sequences, but for the most part, it's the exact same tools, the exact same manner of conducting, the breath and the movements, repetition. It's the exact same. That's the most important thing, the central thing, the breathing, which I'll get to. And of course, A.G. Mohan. A.G. Mohan is very similar in many respects to TKV Deshikacharya's presentation of a therapeutic approach. Some differences in terminology used, but predominantly the same system. And Ramaswamy, he's teaching this Vinyasa Krama system and also the Shastras. Also, TKV Deshikachar and A.G. Mohan, they taught and teach the Shastras as they learned from their Acharya. So, to reiterate, Vinyasa Krama Yoga is the yoga system of practice taught by a longtime direct pupil of Sri T. Krishnamacharyas, Srivatsa Ramaswamy, who learned from the acclaimed Yoga Acharya for over 30 years. Though not exclusive, the Vinyasa Krama system is not exclusively something taught by Ramaswamy. I'll reiterate, of course, it has much to do with what we see in the output of Deshikachar and A.G. Mohan and Sri Bhashyam to a certain extent, and Sri Shubha. Nevertheless, I'm presenting as I learned it from my teacher, Srivatsa Ramaswamy. That's the best service I can do, is to present what I know best, which is Ramaswamy Sir's presentation, and point out some of the areas where I've seen with Deshikachar where there's similarities or maybe certain distinctions. So if you watch my previous video, you'll also see some brief outlining of what are the focuses of these individual teachers. In any case, so over the course of his studies under the Professor Krishnamacharya, Ramaswamy Sir learned the complete system of Vinyasa Krama, including the powerful practice of the important mudras and pranayama from his teacher, several classic Sanskrit texts, and Vedic chanting. Central to Ramaswamy's teachings is in clarifying the breadth or scope of the system of practice he learned from his Acharya, and in highlighting the scholarly brilliance of Sri T. Krishnamacharya, who himself was not just a master practitioner of Hatha Yoga, having apprenticed under Himalayan yogi Sri Ramamohan Brahmachari, but also an accomplished Sanskrit scholar of high order with several titles of distinction for his immense scholarship. At his core, Sri T. Krishnamacharya was a highly devout bhakti yogi, or a bhakta. Coming from an authentic lineage of householder yogis, going back to the Sampradaya, or lineage tradition, of sages Namalvar and Nata Muni. What Srivatsa Ramaswamy teaches is mostly analogous in confluence with what is seen in TKV Deshikachar, A.G. Mohan, TK Sri Bhashyam, and Sri Shubha Mohan Kumar. So, also, more specifically to do with Vinyasa Krama. Now let's get into it. The practice of Vinyasa Krama draws from the scriptural authority of the classic texts or Shastras and authentic lineage of practitioners. It's a practitioner's lineage. Also informed by the Shastras, Krishnamacharya, like I said, was a very accomplished Sanskrit scholar, Vedic scholar. So he was a scholar practitioner, which gave the Shastras that remarkable insight, coming from lineage teachings from a practitioner's perspective. It is a powerful and meditative breathing practice, incorporating long, smooth breathing with synchronous, slow, and graceful movements. So this is very important point. Yes, Ashtanga Vinyasa is described as a breathing practice, but maybe in a future video I can just show what is the difference in the breathing in Ashtanga Vinyasa versus how it's presented and treated in Vinyasa Krama. Now, this long, smooth breathing with slow, graceful movements, very central. Then there's the concept of logical progression and sequencing, intelligent application of appropriate counter movements or pratikriya wherever necessary. Importance placed on the practice of the bandhas. These are certain muscular engagements and energetic locks, and mudras, which are energetic seals. The treatment of bandhas is slightly different. It's different than how it's presented in Ashtanga Vinyasa. I'm not sure if I could get into it in tremendous detail in this video, as this is meant to be a brief overview, Vinyasa Krama at a glance, though trying to be as comprehensive as I can be at that. Daily practice of a robust pranayama or breathing practices, and all of this leading to the process of meditation, seated meditation, beginning with intense concentration or dharana and on. Of course, the process of meditation starts with that stage of concentration, the practice of concentration, dharana, and then it proceeds to the practice of dhyana, in which there's no more having to tie the mind necessarily. The mind is fixed on the object of meditation, whether it be a mantra or a bhavana visualization, experiential visualization. Patanjali gives many such options of meditation points. He highlights 3 times in the text the use of surrender and devotion to an entity referred to as Ishvara. This may be favorable for those that are devout, such as Sri T. Krishnamacharya, although I won't get into distinctions between Vedanta and Sankhya Yoga. Otherwise, yoga is coming from Sankhya, and you can also understand it from that point of view, which doesn't hold necessarily a Godhead as central. So again, I said that from the start, the chant that I started with, it's non-religious. It's just honoring the teachers, honoring this teaching in any case. And also the system takes into account that along with all of this, we need prerequisite social and personal disciplines. These are the yama, niyama, as outlined in Patanjala Yoga. It is a powerful practice system that brings noticeable improvements in strength and in flexibility, posture and embodied awareness, in breathing and lung function, in proper functioning of the internal organs, and in cultivating greater clarity of mind. Now, at this point, let's share a screen. So here we go. Here's a little document I put together. So, what is the scope of the system of Sri T. Krishnamacharya? What's another word for system is Paddhati. So what is the scope of this Paddhati or system of Sri T. Krishnamacharya as taught to his pupil Srivatsa Ramaswamy and his colleagues? The first and central aspect is the correct breathing, which is to be long and smooth, coupled with slow movements. So, and not just movements, of course, any and all of these positions can be treated in a movement-oriented manner, which is slow. It's not mindless jumping around. There's a concept of jumping vinyasa type movements, but it's actually quite a slow practice, very mindful, led and centered on this long breathing. I like to refer to this as actually this whole vinyasa krama is an exquisite breathing technique. It's really quite profound, and if you really give it the chance to really explore it, you'll notice that it is quite significant and subtle in its profundity. Of course, the breath is a very subtle aspect. Some people might not have the patience for it, might think it's too slow. Nevertheless, Ramaswamy sir teaches the same scope of asanas as seen in Ashtanga Vinyasa across 6 series that Pattabhi Jois taught, or in Iyengar's Light on Yoga, which covers 200 asanas, plus all these pranayama techniques. And the same scope, but it's just focused on this long breathing. So the practice of each asana is more breath-centered in that sense. You may practice fewer asanas than an Ashtanga Vinyasa series, but the focus then is not on completing an entire series of 70 asanas. It's rather focusing on the breath. So doing fewer asanas, selecting asanas strategically day to day, how one is feeling, and you can rotate asanas. So I'll get into all of this. So this is the first and central aspect. Long, smooth breathing, synchronized slow movements, and of course followed by stays with long breathing. So there's these examples here. This is actually from A.G. Mohan's book, Yoga for Body, Breath, and Mind. Very good book. I encourage you to get a copy. So it just outlines you can do these movements in a dynamic way and slow and mindful. It's not just, mindlessly moving, transitioning. It's very mindful. I'll highlight that. I know that there may be some misunderstanding based on certain misrepresentations of what Vinyasa Krama is. Nevertheless, we'll try to do the system justice. So, outlining the breath through the movement, highlighting the breath as part of the movement. So each movement is driven by the breath. Closing movements done on the exhalation, expansive movements done on inhalation. Of course, it's self-explanatory. But if you go with the slow breathing, slow movement, you'll notice that there's a subtlety to it that is actually quite profound. I can't highlight this enough. It was a game changer for me when I decided to explore Vinyasa Krama and went to learn from Ramaswamy sir. I didn't realize how slow he meant for the practices to be. I had his book prior, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. But then only in learning from him, I understood, wow, he's actually asking us to move quite a bit slower than I imagined. And it's quite powerful and significant in that way. Anyways, some might say you can we'll get to the next topic, which is progression and sequencing and also counter movement. But you can see there's a certain logic even to this page, this presentation, which I just grabbed from these books. This one is actually from Dashakacharya's Religiousness in Yoga, this one, because I couldn't find a suitable example of this to counter this pose. So this pose is exhale-oriented, Paschimottanasana, whereas this pose is a counter pose, Chatushparapitam, which is a stand-in for Purvottanasana. Let's move into it on inhale. And you can do that dynamically with the breath. So the asana is not going to give the benefit without the correct breathing. That's the way it's understood in the system. Then we see this movement inhaling to Dviparapitam. It's an inhale-oriented posture, and you come down on exhale. Inhale, come back up. Couldn't be even coupled with an arm movement. In any case, this fits as a logical counterpose from the same plane of movement. So both of these, there's a plane of movement. This is not the only counterpose you could do for Paschimottanasana. In fact, you can do Dviparpitam as a counterpose if one doesn't necessarily want to put weight onto the palms and the wrists. In any case, Dviparpitam with Apanasana, in this tradition we call this Apanasana. We raise the head, we call it Pavanamuktasana, but with the head down, we refer to it as Apanasana because it's contracting the region below the navel where the vital wind, the Apana Vayu, is said to reside, which governs the functioning of the organs in the pelvic region, which are associated with evacuation, excretion, etc. Now, then this is also an inhale-oriented posture, Bhujangasana, done dynamically to highlight the breathing. And then, of course, you can stay after, let's say, three times moving dynamically with the breath. This, certainly the first pose described here, is exhale-oriented, acts as a counterpose to the Bhujangasana. And it could be seen in the same plane of movement. So they're both lying down, this supine Dviparapitam Apanasana and Bhujangasana and Balasana. They're lying down, except the difference is this line, the third line here, is supine, looking upward, and the lowest line, the fourth line, is lying on one's abdomen, face down. Now, in regards to logical sequencing and progression, or vinyasa krama. So vinyasa is a technical term, is a combination of the prefix vi, which denotes vishesha, which is particular, unique, and nyasa. Nyasa is a term associated with Vedic ritual, which involves various nyasas that are supported by mantras. And here it's a particular type of placement of the body, krama meaning in steps. So this is what's denoted logical sequencing and progression, or vinyasa krama, which implies that there's a counter movement procedure afterward. This is referred to as pratikriya, the opposite action. So here I showed different standing variations as they are linked with the breath, seated position and its counterpose, a lying supine position and a counterpose, lying prone position and its counterpose. These are quite accessible to most people, these variants. And as we proceed, we'll see more and more fantastic asanas. Of course, just for exposition. So there's various vinyasas in this standing with the feet together, the Tadasana sequence, There's also variations standing with the feet apart, like Trikonasana. So we have standing on the toes, we have bending, spinal movements, bending to one side and the other side. We have spinal twists with different arm movements, different hasta vinyasas, different variations of where to place the arms when doing it, which give different function. And with the forward bending movement, of course, Uttanasana. And then as far as the standing with feet apart, Trikonasana, which has a lateral variant, twisted variant. This is just an example. I'm not showing all of them, not at this point. And the way that sequence of the feet apart ends is with the feet widest apart, Prasarita Padottanasana, which it's a forward bend, and it could act as a counter movement after twisting the spine. Of course, in Deshka tradition, they might opt rather for Uttanasana, a simple forward bend, rather than the feet wide, or Utkatasana, a squatting position. Now, what else in terms of logical progression and sequencing and counter movement in terms of vinyasa krama? Well, here we have example in the seated position, in this seated sequence. We have the Ardha Padma sequence. It starts with Ardha Padma Paschimottanasana with the bind, so it's Ardha Baddha Padma Paschimottanasana, which includes a twist to open to that side with the hand behind the back holding the big toe, or twisting to the other side where the hand behind the back is rather grabbing the inner thigh of the lotus leg. Some may be able to reach even the ankle of that leg. So twisting in one direction, twisting to the other, even lifting up in Utpluti. And it's not shown, but one can even get up into a lateral stretch from the seated position, like a side plank. Normally we enter the side plank from the dog pose, but here it's possible as an alternate entrance. You can enter it from the seated position. In any case, there's also the counter pose. I'll outline most of these aren't seen in Ashtanga Vinyasa nor in Iyengar Yoga. So just here in this sequence, you can see there's a progression exploring different variants, bending forward, twisting to one side, twisting to the other side, lifting up, bending back. This is the counter movement to the forward bend. Okay. And then there's also, and I'm focusing here like in a microcosm kind of way. What about Vinyasa Krama in terms of the supine positions? Well, ultimately we'd be targeting the Sarvangasana, for instance. Of course, not everyone can or should practice Sarvangasana, but I give it here as an example. It's considered an important asana. Of course, if there's any reason a person shouldn't practice it, there's other asanas that can stand in that have similar function, operating from function rather than form, of course. There's ways to modify as well. And Iyengar, of course, devised many ways to modify using props, in any case. So supine, here we have the Tadaka Mudra, Apanasana, as we saw, Dvi Parapitam, Urdhva Prasarita Pada Hastasana. So these three supine positions in particular prepare for inverting onto the shoulders. So first, the preliminary being Viparita Karani Mudra, or the position Viparita Karani. Then Sarvangasana proper, when you straighten the body. This is considered, the Sarvangasana is considered a Viparita Karani Mudra, an inverted process mudra that we see described in the Hatha texts. The preliminary Viparita Karani position is seen as a less acute angle on the neck, so it may be beneficial for some to utilize this instead of the straight up position. Of course, in Iyengar, they prop up the base of the shoulders and have the head at a lower level, which has the same kind of less acute angle to the neck joint, with the addition of the prop setup height for the shoulders. In any case, it's not impossible to do it on the flat on the ground. Everybody needs to understand what their needs are, go sensitively, work slowly with the breathing. You see, with the slow breath, all of this nuance is revealed. Okay, not to push, right? Now, what is the counter pose? My teacher likes to get us to do Bhujangasana as a counter pose because it is simpler than what can be considered the classical counter pose, that's Matsyasana. And often in Ashtanga Vinyasa, you see Matsyasana as counter pose followed by Uttana Padasana. So these are supine in nature. We've already done these supine postures. So to get also another energetic benefit is to include this other asana category of lying prone and doing a back arch while lying prone rather than lying on the back. So we get a more rounded practice in that sense. Another possibility is, of course, doing a deeper backbend from the supine position, Urdhva Dhanurasana. But in any case, my teacher tended to prefer Bhujangasana, and that is also the case with Deshikachar Sir and A.G. Mohan, and even Sri Shubha Ma'am and T.K. Sri Bhashyam. So much confluence between all of these teachers. Everybody's is treating the breath in the same way, similar manner, long breathing, slow movements. Now, also, a progression or vinyasa krama to Shirshasana. So, of course, preliminary to Shirshasana is Sarvangasana. You have to have learned Sarvangasana first, the shoulder stand, before attempting a headstand. And one can sequence to stand on the shoulders prior to attempt standing on the head. Of course, you could do so at the wall. So here, just preparing for it, of course, with the supine preparation to even stand on the shoulders, and then doing rather this preliminary position, the Viparita position, then coming down and then setting up for Shirshasana, the headstand position. But then Shirshasana in this teaching must follow with its necessary counter pose. So the way Ramaswamy teaches, the way Deshikachar teaches, the way A.G. Mohan teaches, the way Sri Bhashyam teaches, they all treat that Shirshasana follows with Sarvangasana. Sarvangasana is the counter pose, the necessary counter pose to Shirshasana. I know it's opposite in Ashtanga Vinyasa. Nevertheless, Ramaswamy, Deshikachar, Mohan, Sri Bhashyam, they all teach that Shirshasana then follows with Sarvangasana. In fact, in Iyengar Yoga, Shirshasana is always before Sarvangasana. So there's a certain confluence there. It's also the same in Shivananda Yoga, in fact, taught by Swami Vishnudevananda. In any case, that's a whole other lineage tree. But anyways, you see this relation that's Shirshasana before Sarvangasana. And the counterpose here, I'm opting for Bhujangasana, demonstrating that. So now, what about the prone variants? So this is one example. You could do a one-leg Dhanurasana or two legs, right? There's a progression there. And you could, the first is grabbing like backward reaching, but then the more advanced is trying to do so with an overhead grip, the Parangushta grip to grab the big toe. Of course, in this way, I needed a belt. That's borrowing from the Iyengar perspective. Otherwise, doing so with 2 feet, so there's a progression there again. 1 leg, 2 legs. There I'm doing without the belt. And then a counter pose, Vajrasana, forward fold. You may know it as Balasana, child's pose, which it could also be lying on one's back, doing Apanasana rather. It's an option for counter pose. So you can see progression and counter movement. Now, so there's an importance placed on the practice of the bandhas, certain muscular engagements. So before I say that, I'll go back here. Ramaswamy sir talks about this, what I'm talking about, in Krishnamacharya's teachings, in terms of vinyasa krama, progressively learning in steps, and while the student is exposed to a wide range of asana types and movements early on, in any case, just how far they go within each type is dependent on capacity, or yatha shakti. This is a term you see in some hatha texts. They even use the term shanaihi, shanaihi, so work slowly, carefully, in other words. There's also an aspect of practice involving long stays in static positions to employ the bandhas The bandhas with correct breathing with the mudras. So with the correct breathing, the bandhas are applied with kumbhaka. Not everyone should practice kumbhaka, and it's a gradual process of developing such techniques. Nevertheless, the way it's taught by Deshikachar and Ramaswamy Sir, bandhas are applied decidedly during Bahya Kumbhaka, exhale retention. You may, if you've read Hatha text, that you may have noticed that there's often description of applying bandhas on Antar Kumbhaka, the inhale retention. But in Krishnamacharya teachings, he's coming from a householder tradition, and he gave this this rationale that exhale retention for bandhas, particularly the Uddiyana bandha, is more appropriate to the householder on Bahya Kumbhaka, the exhale retention, as doing so during Antar Kumbhaka puts undue pressure on the pelvic organs in that way. So he considered that more for celibate practitioners, not for householder yogis. So I'll just give you that note. I'm just going through this quickly. These are some of the most profound practices and procedures, techniques seen in Vinyasa Krama, and it takes time to develop. And again, it's going to this long breathing that makes it so profound and effective. Now, so this preceding practice is said to reduce systemic rajas in excess in kinetic energy. So this might manifest, because the overall goal of yoga is for meditation. Patanjali is talking about yoga as meditation, essentially. All of this is meant to lead to meditation. So it's thought that practicing these vinyasas, variations, they go a certain way to expend excess in this kinetic energy, this rajas. And the preceding procedure is then leading to sitting for pranayama proper, which is said to reduce systemic tamas, or dullness of the mind, in order to allow sattva, which is clarity, to ascend, making the mind fit for the meditation process. There's also a progression there, right? So here I'm demonstrating pranayama with the bandhas. I'll also go back to the Vinyasa Krama for an instance. We looked initially on the microcosm, just standing group. Here's a counter pose, a counter movement to twisting of the spine. Here, this is a sequence of half lotus, and then the counter movement. Here's supine leading to the Sarvangasana and counter movement, different options of counter movement, and then a progression to get to the headstand and counter movement, which also necessitates its own counter movement, or prone progression and then counter movement. But also in a macrocosm, rather, you can see this itself can be treated as a practice sequence. Like, firstly, this can be treated as a practice sequence: standing, seated, supine, prone, and then you can rest and then take pranayama. Or what about this? You have standing. This twist is selected perhaps to work on then twisting here in the half lotus variant. Then that's followed by its counter pose. And of course, then there's this progression to the important inverted mudra and its counter pose. Or you can see perhaps including both Viparita Karani mudras as the Shirshasana is considered a Viparita Karani Mudra, followed by its sister pose, Sarangasana, which is also a Viparita Karani Mudra. They work together effectively. And then you can utilize a prone position as a counterpose. Maybe you want to do an extreme prone position as a counterpose to Sarangasana. Nevertheless, I give here that example. And then all this is leading to pranayama. Do emphasis on these bandhas. These bandhas performed in certain mudras. Here's Tadaka Mudra, Paschimottanasana with the bandhas with its counter pose, Shirshasana followed by Sarvangasana's counter pose, classical counter pose, done with bandhas, so they are considered Viparita Karani Mudras, the inverted mudras, followed by a counter pose. And then Maha Mudra, the great mudra, followed by Baddha Konasana, which is how Ramaswamy outlines it, as per Krishnamacharya's teachings deriving from the Yoga Rahasya. One follows Mahamudra with Baddha Konasana. It's not exactly what's seen in Hatha Pradipika, what follows Mahamudra, but nevertheless, Krishnamacharya is coming from a householder tradition, and he didn't emphasize certain aspects of Hatha Yoga because he was more concerned with Raja Yoga in general. Hatha Yoga is meant to be oriented to Raja Yoga, this kingly path of yoga, which is broadly having to do with the mind and meditation. And that's been associated with Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. Nevertheless. So, asana vinyasa is to expend excess kinetic energy, or rajas, is a quality of nature. Pranayama to expend dullness of the mind, or tamas, which then allows sattva, or clarity of the mind, to ascend, which makes the mind fit for meditation, the process of meditation. Earlier I mentioned dharana, dhyana, and of course it culminates in samadhi. Not everyone can attain to that. It's a lifelong journey to develop our capacity in our seated meditation practice. And there's also a 3 stages of life model that I'll get to later. So all this is only rendered effective in controlling our intake of the gunas through yama niyama. So if asanas take care to reduce systemic rajas, and pranayama takes care to reduce systemic tamas, we also need to take certain responsibility through yama niyama, which controls our intake of the gunas, these qualities of nature, through the yama niyama, which again I mentioned there are certain social and personal observances and disciplines. It's in monitoring our behaviors and observances as requisite practice to the rest. Of course, it's a whole yoga anga sadhana. There's many limbs to the practice. It's not just asanas, and it's meant to culminate in this process of meditation, eventually to the state of samadhi, which is not an easy feat. It takes a lifelong sadhana. Here is a pratyahara, the withdrawal of the senses, as through Shanmukhi Mudra. And then just an example, just sitting for meditation. There's all sorts of things one can do in meditation. It's outside of the scope of this talk to really get into that too. Krishnamacharya was an orthodox individual, and he followed Vedic ritual daily. And that Vedic ritual leads to sitting and doing mantra recitation, or japa, as meditation on the sacred Vedic mantra. So, and that, like I said, Vedic ritual has all sorts of procedures that prepare for the main event. That's the japa, the recitation of mantra. So these nyasas, the hand placements that are supported by other supporting mantras, and then finally sitting for meditation, and then also a process of coming out of that, which might I highlight that that's also a vinyasa krama. There's a progression and there's like a counter movement, a counter procedure to coming out of meditation. Now, a word on the yamas and niyamas. Yama is social disciplines. Niyama is more so concerned with personal observances. So, as according to Patanjali, he outlines 5 yamas and 5 niyamas. This is not meant to get into any detail about this topic, but I'll outline 2 important yamas and 2 important niyamas. As far as the yamas, the 2 important yamas include ahimsa, or non-violence, and satya, or truthfulness. 2 important niyamas include committing to self-discipline, or tapas. There's many ways to break down the word tapas. It's a loaded Sanskrit word. A lot of these Sanskrit words are very loaded. It takes some time to unpack. But anyways, self-discipline, or tapas, and self-study, or swadhyaya. So this is yama niyama in a nutshell, some of the important aspects.